Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever recorded in Mississippi. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're listening from and the exact time you started this story. It's always fascinating to see how far these forgotten histories travel, across states, across oceans, across time itself. Let's begin. The year was 1880, a damp spring that never quite warmed. Down in the lowlands of western Mississippi, the river had eaten its banks, leaving great stretches of gray mud where cattails bent in the wind. The settlement of Cypress Hollow wasn't much more than a scatter of whitewashed houses, a sawmill and a narrow road that disappeared into the pines. Folks said it was a peaceful place, but peace here was often just the quiet before something broke. At the center of the hollow stood a one-room chapel, St. Matthew's School and Mission, built from cypress boards cut straight from the swamp. Every Sunday morning, the bell on its small steeple would ring out over the water, calling children from miles around. Barefoot boys in patched trousers, little girls in faded cotton dresses, 42 in all from farms, shanties, and tenant cabins. Their parents trusted the chapel. They said it was the one bit of light left in that valley. The man who kept that bell ringing was Reverend Dunn. Tall, spare and soft-spoken, he'd come from somewhere up in Tennessee a few years before, carrying a Bible bound in cracked leather, and a strange sort of calm. He taught the children their letters, their hymns, and the rules of proper conduct. He kept careful notes in a ledger, attendance, scripture verses, birthdays. Everything about him seemed orderly. Too orderly, some said. The hollow had its own rhythm, the sound of frogs in the swamp, the whistle of the sawmill, the bell for Sunday school. Life passed slow, predictable, until one morning in late May 1880, when the fog came rolling in thick off the river and the bell rang, but no echo came back. That morning, parents sent their children down the old road as always, 42 small figures fading one by one into the mist. The sun climbed, the fog burned off, but by noon, at the time they should have been walking home, the road stayed empty. By sunset, mothers were calling from porches, fathers hitching mules, lanterns swinging in their hands. The chapel doors stood shut. The bell rope hung still. Inside, the benches were neatly arranged. Hymn books lay open, pages fluttering in the draught. But the desks, the coats, the children, all gone. Only the Reverend's ledger remained on the pulpit, a page torn clean out. The first night passed in disbelief. People told themselves the children had wandered off, maybe taken by a sudden storm toward the river. By dawn, they were combing every field and hollow. The sheriff rode in from Greenville with 2 deputies. They found wagon tracks behind the chapel, leading south toward the marsh road, then vanishing into the reeds. No sign of Reverend Dunn, no footprints, nothing. Just wheel ruts, shallow and strange, as if the wagon had been heavy when it left, lighter when it returned. Days turned into weeks. The searches widened, reaching the river itself. The current dragged low that summer, slow and brown, catching bits of cloth and driftwood. A bonnet here, a single shoe there, always half buried, always uncertain. Nothing that could prove anything. But the ledger told a quieter story. In neat ink, the last entry read, "All present. Praise be." Folks began to whisper that the Reverend had gone mad, or that someone else had taken the children for reasons best left unspoken. Some said it was the old slave trading paths beneath the cypress, tunnels dug years before, now flooded and hidden. Others swore they heard singing at night, children's voices rising faint through the swamp mist. No one went near the chapel after dark. A month later, a steamboat captain reported seeing a wagon overturned near a levee 20 miles downstream. The deputies rowed out and found it half sunk in silt. No bodies, no bones, just a handful of small slates, initials scratched into them. The letters matched names from the ledger. The state sent an investigator from Jackson, Marshal Eli Harris, a veteran of Reconstruction patrols. He kept to himself, methodical, more used to chasing smugglers than ghosts. Harris spent 3 days walking the site, measuring, sketching, and quietly collecting things no one else noticed. A child's button, a torn ribbon, a nail blackened by fire. On his 4th night, he took a room above the general store and began writing his report. The clerk who saw him said he looked pale, his hands shaking. By morning, the marshal was gone. His horse remained tied to the post. On the desk, an unfinished note reading only, "They weren't taken by men." The line spread like fever. Whole families left Cypress Hollow before autumn. The sawmill closed. The chapel roof caved under the winter rain, yet a few stayed behind, the ones who refused to believe what they couldn't see. They said truth could be found if a man had the patience to dig deep enough. In 1882, a traveling carpenter named Emmett Cole stopped in the hollow, hired to salvage boards from the ruined chapel. He worked alone for 2 days, stacking the wood neatly by the fence. On the third, his hammer went through the floorboards and struck something hollow. He pried it open and found a space beneath the altar, a crawl no higher than a child's shoulder. Inside lay 42 small hymn books, bound together with twine, perfectly dry. Not a body, not a bone, just the books, each one marked with a name. Cole packed up and left before dawn. He didn't ask for payment. The story might have ended there, just another legend drowned by the river, if not for what happened 6 years later. When new settlers tried to rebuild, they cleared brush, cut fresh cypress, and laid out a foundation where the chapel had stood. But each night the tools went missing. Stakes pulled from the ground, saws rusted overnight, chalk lines smeared clean. The foreman, a practical man from Vicksburg, finally posted 2 guards. By morning, both were gone. Their rifles were found upright in the mud, bayonets pointed to the sky. The county abandoned the project. The land was marked unfit for development on official survey maps, though no one ever said why. For the next decade, locals treated the hollow like cursed soil. Hunters circled wide. Travelers who lost their way reported strange noises, the faint tolling of a bell where no building stood. By 1895, the last of the original families had moved away. Cypress Hollow vanished from most maps altogether, surviving only in scattered letters and one brittle ledger, found decades later in a courthouse attic. The torn page was never replaced, and yet every so often, a name would resurface. A child grown old under a different one, claiming half memories of singing, of a wagon in the fog, of hands telling them to hush. Most were dismissed as drifters or the feeble-minded. But one account, from a woman in Louisiana, held too many details to ignore. The hymns, the teacher's calm voice, the smell of cypress pitch on his coat. She couldn't recall how she'd escaped, only that the others hadn't. As the century turned, the story drifted into folklore, the Sunday school disappearance, they called it. Campfire talk whispered warnings to keep children close. No official record mentioned it again, but something about the way the swamp held silence, the way the fog thickened every May morning, kept the tale alive, and for those who passed the ruins at a few leaning posts, half buried in moss, there was always that feeling, like being watched by eyes too small and too many to name. The summer of 1883 came early and cruel, pressing heat down on the delta like a wet blanket. Most people had long since given up searching, but Sheriff Ames, who'd been a young deputy during the first days of the disappearance, couldn't leave it be. He rode back out to the hollow alone, more out of restlessness than duty. The way an old soldier revisits a battlefield he never quite left behind. The chapel was gone, eaten by vines and moss, its foundation only a black outline in the earth. The air smelled of mildew and something sweetly rotten, like sap gone sour. He tethered his horse under the sycamores and walked the perimeter with a lantern. When the flame passed over the ground, it caught on flecks of glass, bits of old window panes scattered like salt. Each shard reflected light, as if it still remembered what it once saw. He found the pit where the carpenter had struck the hollow floorboards. The hole had filled with rainwater, dark and still. When Ames knelt and lowered his hand, the surface trembled. Beneath the reflection of his own face, he thought he saw other shapes, smaller, pale, sliding just out of view. He pulled back fast and told himself it was minnows, or the shifting of his own lantern. That night he made camp a mile off, under a cottonwood ridge. The wind came up around midnight. He woke to the sound of wood striking wood, slow, deliberate, like a mallet driving nails. But when he looked out, the forest was still. In the distance, faint and hollow, came the echo of children reciting a prayer. "Now I lay me down to sleep." The voices overlapped uneven, rising and falling like the river's breath. By morning, Ames was gone. His horse was found 2 days later wandering the Greenville Road, saddle torn loose, eyes wild. No sign of the man. The hollow swallowed him the way it had swallowed the rest. After that, the county line was moved. Maps listed the area simply as private wetland, a bureaucratic term that meant best forgotten. But curiosity never really dies, it only sleeps. In 1898, a group of geology students from a new college in Jackson came through on a survey expedition. They camped at the edge of the swamp for 3 nights, recording soil layers and sketching the topography. One of them, a quiet boy named Lowell, kept a private diary. His entries survive in the college archives. The last pages are smeared and water-stained, but one sentence is still legible. "There's something under us that hums when the bell rings." No bell stood in the hollow then. The nearest church was 12 miles away. By the turn of the century, Cypress Hollow was nothing but a rumor, an overgrown scar of land left off deeds and stories alike. But in 1902, railroad surveyors reached the edge of it while plotting a new freight line. They cut through dense brush, found the ground soft and uneven, their boots sinking inches with every step. The foreman, an Irishman named O'Malley, noted a series of shallow depressions arranged in 2 rows, 40, maybe more. He thought they were sinkholes. When his men tried to fill them, the soil kept sinking back. O'Malley ordered them to lay rails elsewhere. But one of the younger workers, a man called Harlan, returned after hours. He claimed he heard whispers coming from the pits, faint, childish voices calling numbers as if in a classroom roll. 1, 2, 3. He ran before they reached 42. When questioned later, he said he wasn't afraid at first, only confused. Then the counting stopped, and a single voice said his name. The hollow stayed untouched for another 20 years. The world outside changed. Trains came, factories rose, wars started, but the swamp remained the same. The few who lived nearby noticed that nothing grew right there. Grass browned too early. Trees twisted as if leaning away from something unseen. Hunters swore their dogs refused to enter. More than once, travelers trying to cross the floodplain at night ended up circling until dawn, always finding themselves back at the same rotted fence post. In 1910, an aging newspaperman named Charles Brandt came looking for stories of Reconstruction-era towns that had vanished. He found mention of St. Matthew's in an 1879 census and followed the trail. Locals warned him off, but he had a taste for the morbid. Brandt arrived in the hollow in mid-June and set up a small canvas tent. His notes, discovered years later among his effects, described the place as suffocatingly silent, as though even the insects had learned better manners. He spent 3 days mapping what he believed were building foundations. On the 4th, he heard the bell. Not loud, and just a single toll somewhere deep in the trees. When he followed the sound, he found nothing. But in the mud at his feet were dozens of footprints, small, bare, perfectly formed, leading nowhere. Brandt returned to his tent shaken, intending to leave at dawn. Instead, he sat up late, writing by lamplight. The last page in his notebook reads, "If I could find the page they tore out, perhaps they could rest." He was found days later in Vicksburg, half-conscious on a train, clutching a water-stained ledger page. On it were 42 names written in unfamiliar handwriting. The ink bled red where it should have been black. By then, the legend was part of Mississippi's darker folklore, told in boarding houses and taverns, a warning for children who strayed too far. Some claimed the Reverend's ghost still preached in the ruins, calling his pupils one by one to finish their lessons. Others said the land itself had taken them, a punishment, a sacrifice, or something older than Scripture. But every version ended the same way. 42 gone, none returned, and every May, when the fog rolls over the river and the air smells of wet wood, folks swear they still hear a bell ring once far off, followed by the sound of children laughing. Faint, quick, gone before you can be sure. The spring of 1918 came in ragged, carrying the last cold from a hard winter and the uneasy quiet of a world ending somewhere across the ocean. In Mississippi, men returned from the river work camps thin and hollow-eyed, and women mended the same shirts twice over. The land at Cypress Hollow had sat untouched so long that surveyors had to guess where the boundaries fell. When folks talked about reclaiming it, they did so in lowered voices, as if the trees might overhear. They tried anyway. A small settlement formed that April. 24 souls all told, carpenters from Yazoo City, a widowed teacher with a trunk of primers, 3 families of tenant farmers with more children than shoes, and one reluctant preacher who'd sworn he'd never shepherd another congregation but agreed to bless the ground for form's sake. They built a cluster of tents first, then shanties of rough plank and tarred paper. The men talked about a schoolroom with big windows and a proper bell the children could pull themselves. The widowed teacher said she'd ring it only once a day, not like the old mission, which, she said, had been too strict to be good for any soul, living or otherwise. On the first morning they broke ground, the air was clear and thin. A pair of kites circled high above like bits of loose paper, and someone joked that even the birds weren't afraid of stories. They set their stakes in a clean rectangle and ran a taut string where the front wall would stand. The ground sank underfoot in the same tired way it always had, but there was no stench, no trick of fog. Only the smell of newly split cypress and the faint sweetness of sap. They had a map, new drawn, with lines no older than the ink, and it put the new schoolhouse a good 20 yards north of the old chapel's footprint. The preacher took comfort in that. So did the men, who believed in measurements more than whispers. When a boy uncovered a blackened nail while kicking at the dirt, his mother told him to throw it away. He did. Then he went back and looked for another. Children have their own ways of taking a place's measure. By midday, the foreman, a sandy-haired man called Fletcher, called a break. People ate hoe cakes and cold ham in the shade and spoke of ordinary things, the price of flour, the rail schedule, the sermon next Sunday if there was to be a sermon. The widowed teacher, she preferred to be called Mrs. Lane, took her lunch standing, staring at the rectangle of dirt as if she might will it to hold. When work resumed, a post-hole digger struck something at 4 feet, not wood, not stone. It made a sound like metal against a thin shell. A second man widened the hole. They found a lid, tin, shallow, dented at one corner. Fletcher wiped it with his sleeve and lifted it free. Inside lay 32 slate pencils, each sharpened to a neat point and wrapped in oiled paper, untouched by rust. Beneath them, that same paper folded over a stack of hymn slips, the kind cut from broader sheets, numbering the verses at the top. The paper looked new, and it should not have. Mrs. Lane touched the edge with care and said very quietly that the hymn numbers were wrong. They were the older set, numbering that had fallen out of favor decades before. The ink, though, was still dark, as if it had slept under a different sky. Some wanted to bury the box back. The preacher said no, that it was only a teacher's cache from long ago, nothing more, nothing less. He leaned in and read a line on one of the slips, his voice steady. It was a child's hand. The words were simple and clean, almost shy. There was no accusation in the ink, no plea. Only a verse copied carefully, and a date that didn't fit the world as they knew it. They kept the pencils. It felt wasteful not to. For a week the work went on without a murmur. The frame rose, the ridgepole set true, rafters lined up like ribs. The children played among the cut-offs and pretended. The new school already held a class. Mrs. Lane marked a bare plank as her board, drawing letters with a charcoal end and asking the little ones to copy in the dust with their fingers. The preacher carved a shallow cross over the front lintel in a moment when no one was looking, and then planed it smooth so it wouldn't show. On the 8th day, a rain came in steady and straight, a wash that made the air smell like the inside of a barrel. They covered the lumber and huddled under canvas, listening to the world narrow to the sound of water. Toward evening, when the rain softened to a bright hiss, a boy named Whit ran from the trees with a muddy face and a grin so wide it looked split. He had found something, he said, near the old fence line. Something good. They followed him over the spongy ground to where a cluster of muscadine vines hung heavy and unpicked. Children love sweetness, and grown folks forget how bright it can be. The vines had grown up and over what looked like a row of half-buried stones. Only they weren't stones. They were wooden posts, cut short and worn round by years. Each had been notched once at the top, a simple mark you could find anywhere a man needed to count. The preacher crouched and touched the nearest notch. It was smooth with handling, and something like oil slicked his fingers. Not fresh oil. The old kind, the kind that seeps out of wood when a heat you can't name has passed through it. That night the rain cleared and the air went cool, as if someone had lifted a heavy blanket. The settlement slept easy. Even the dogs, who'd spent a week with their hackles up and their noses to the wind, relaxed. Toward midnight, somewhere far in the cypress, a single bell rang. One note, pure, thin, almost pretty for how brief it was. No one woke. Come morning, they found small things not where they'd been left. A hammer tucked under the steps, a chalk line coiled and knotted as neatly as in a shop. Mrs. Lane's ledger, she had begun one for the new class, out of habit and hope, sat, open to a blank page, and on it a finger had traced 5 faint circles in the dust. Not letters, not numbers, circles. She brushed them away and said nothing. More rain came, the kind that makes puddles look like poured lead. The ground along the north wall gave underfoot and settled a measure lower than the rest. Fletcher said the soil had a memory and would need tamping. They tamped. It sank again that night. On the 12th day, a boy failed to answer his mother's call. He was only 3 properties over, standing ankle-deep in a shaded pool where the ground had sunk and taken rain with it. He stared into the water as if watching himself age. When his father ran to him, the boy finally spoke. He said he was counting. When asked what, he said he didn't know, only that he'd started at 1 and had been afraid to stop. No one brought it up that evening around the big pot of beans, and yet everyone ate too fast. The following Sabbath, they held a short service under the raw frame. No walls, just the sky, trusses like uplifted hands. The preacher read from the Psalms, steady as a field hand, spreading seed. He said nothing about the other place that had sat here once. He said nothing at all about children. When he finished, the settlement stood quiet. The wind lifted the pages of his Bible and dropped them again as if reconsidering. After, the men walked the fence line and found the remains of a path they hadn't seen, a faint corridor through the low brush, leading to what might have been a side door long ago. Along that path, shallow impressions showed in pairs, then threes, then clotted into a muddle like wheat crimped by a storm. Fletcher said it was hog sign. A few nodded, grateful for any ordinary thing to say aloud. That afternoon, Mrs. Lane took 6 children to gather wildflowers for a table she swore the new school needed. Even if the legs were only sawhorses for now, they crossed the clearing, picked buttercups from damp edges, and followed the corridor's curve without meaning to. Mrs. Lane kept count of heads as teachers do. 6, confirmed each time she looked. The air turned cooler. The ground felt springy. The children's shoes darkened as if the mud rose to meet them. When they reached the place where the post sat under the muscadine, a smell came up, clean, sharp, like iron grated on stone. The smallest girl, Ruth, reached to touch the vine and drew back with a hiss. A line of red beaded on her finger, where a thorn had done what thorns do. She put the finger in her mouth. Mrs. Lane took a handkerchief and bound it with a gentleness so practiced it felt like a prayer. Then she looked at the girls' faces, at their small urgent eyes, and saw they were listening to something she could not yet hear. "Back," Mrs. Lane said, soft, as if backing away from a skittish horse. "We're going back now." They turned. The air brightened in that way the sky has when a cloud slips its edge from the sun. A sound like a soft knock came from the earth, then another, then a third. The children did not hurry, neither did Mrs. Lane. To hurry would be to name the thing that walked beside them. They returned to the frame and the shade. No one asked why flowers had not come with them. No one needed them. That night, the preacher sat awake with a lantern low and his Bible closed. He listened for the bell and heard nothing. He listened for water and heard only the small clicks of beetles in the wall. Toward dawn, when unkind dreams lose their teeth, he slept. In that sleep, he stood again in the old mission, with its tight windows and its thin door. Children sat at rows of benches, back straight, hands folded. He turned and found he had no face. He woke with a shout, knocked his lamp from the crate, and watched a black puddle of oil bloom at his feet. On the 14th day, the ground gave way. It happened under the north wall where the soil had kept sinking, a neat rectangle as if cut. The earth slumped in and left a shallow basin the size of a wagon bed, half full of grey water, the surface trembling though the wind went still. A pair of men tried to shore it with boards. The boards sank to their ankles and stuck like they'd been nailed to the mud by an unseen carpenter. When they tried to pry them back, the pry bars sank too. Fletcher swore. He ordered everyone back and stood with his hands on his hips and breathed through his teeth. Mrs. Lane moved the children to the south side and told a story about a fox and a foolish goat. Her voice steadied on the second sentence. By the third, eyes lowered and shoulders unhitched. The preacher walked to the pit's edge and knelt. He took a stick long as a cane and dipped it gently. The water dimpled, cleared, and what lay beneath came into view. It wasn't a floor, it was a ceiling. Planks set edge to edge with the tight stinginess of a man who will not waste wood. Between two planks, something white and thin had lodged like a fishbone. The preacher reached with the stick's tip, coaxed it loose and lifted it into daylight, a ribbon. Faded but fine, the kind a careful mother ties on a Sabbath morning and straightens with a thumb. No rot, no fray. The bow still held. He turned it in his hands, and a smell like clean soap rose, too strong for anything that had been sleeping in swamp water. He glanced over his shoulder as if he had been caught. "Close it," Fletcher said. "Fill it with what?" Someone answered. "With what?" They tried. They rolled logs, hauled sand in sacks that split and bled away, threw in brush that went under like it was learning to drown. The basin accepted everything and asked for more. The sun slipped a degree and then another. The air took on the tired gold of late afternoon. When the last sack vanished and left only that trembling sheet of water, Fletcher told them to leave it. "Ain't our fight," he said, half to the hole, half to the preacher. That evening, Mrs. Lane opened her ledger to enter the day's notes. The page she turned to was not the one she had left. It was half filled with small, careful writing in a child's hand, listing first names in a column. The ink lay fresh as breath. She dropped the book. It landed face down, and when she lifted it, the page was blank again. She shut the ledger gently and set it under her mattress and told herself about bad paper and cheap ink and tired eyes. Over supper, no one mentioned the ribbon. The children grew drowsy on full bellies. The men smoked. The women washed tin plates with water drawn far from the north wall. When night came, it was thick and quick, as if the sun had been plucked rather than set. Near midnight, a soft sound began under the trusses, like slates being stacked one by one. Then a child coughed in sleep and the sound stopped. A minute later, the faintest ring of metal on metal came from the north. Not a bell, smaller, a spoon against a cup. Then from the trees a brief lift of voices, as if a chorus had cleared their throats and decided against it. The preacher lay awake and counted his heartbeats until he reached 42. He stopped himself at the number as though standing at the lip of a well. Morning came bright, and with it a visitor no one expected, a county man, all stiff collar and pencil mustache, with a folder tied in string. He had a letter authorizing a review of the site for special conditions, and a manner that said he believed in ink more than mud. He asked questions no one liked, about the ground, about water, about old stories that he called offhandedly. Incidents. The preacher watched. Him with the sympathy a man reserves for someone who hasn't yet learned what a place can do to a plan. The county man strode to the north wall and peered at the basin. He smiled thinly and called it a subsidence feature. He said it like a cure. He picked up a stone and tossed it in. It disappeared without a ripple. He frowned, chose a larger one and threw it harder. The water accepted it and went perfectly smooth again. He cleared his throat. Then he reached in his folder, pulled out a sheet stamped with a red seal, and recited a paragraph about safety and delays. He was halfway through when a line of small footprints appeared along the edge of the basin. Not prints in thick mud, prints as if set lightly on a firm floor no one else could see. They tracked past his polished shoes and paused at the place where the ribbon had been found. Then they faced the new schoolhouse frame, as neat and regular as attendance marks. The county man kept reading. His voice thinned, words flattening into a drone that belonged on paper more than in air. Fletcher, who had taken off his hat without realizing, put it back on. That afternoon the men put off work and walked the old paths that the brush still remembered. The preacher trailed behind, not touching anything. They found 2 more shallow basins, and one place where the ground sounded hollow when tapped with a pole. 100 yards beyond, under a tangle of vine, lay a shape like a low table, wood sunk nearly to its back. When they cleared it, the table was not a table at all. It was a door. No hinges showed and no seam to lift by. Only a small circle near one corner where a ring might once have been. No one mentioned prying. No one said the word open. They left it and returned at dusk. Drawn the way a man is drawn to a trail he swears he won't walk. The door sat quiet under the evening light, a plain thing in a plain place. Mrs. Lane stood at a distance with the children and counted their heads. A wind came, stirring the vine tips. For a second a seam showed, a dark line no thicker than a pencil stroke. The preacher took a step before he knew he'd done it. Fletcher caught his sleeve. "Tomorrow," Fletcher said. "In the sun." "Tomorrow," the preacher echoed, as if the word could hold. They slept poorly, each with his own reason. The preacher dreamed again, but this time the benches were empty, and the whitewashed walls breathed like an animal. Mrs. Lane lay with her hand on the ledger under the mattress and felt a quiet tapping, as if a small finger counted against the cardboard back. At first light, they gathered at the door with pry bars and a plank to wedge under. The sky was a bright blank, rinsed clean, the kind of morning that makes a person believe work can solve anything set before him. Fletcher worked the corner with care. The bar bit slid bit again. The door lifted a finger's width, then settled stubborn as a mule. He set his feet and pressed. The wood creaked. A smell like old paper and cool stone pushed into the day. He looked up. The preacher nodded once they levered together. The seam widened. Something inside gave a slow sigh, the sound of long-held breath leaving a cellar. Mrs. Lane gathered the children close without touching them, the way a mother gathers her fear. A single note floated up from the dark then. Thin as thread, as if a bell had been rung with a glove on the hand, they froze. The door hung open the width of a wrist. Fletcher released the bar and stepped back. The preacher leaned forward not to look, but to listen. From below came nothing more than air and the faintest rustle, like pages turned at a careful speed. "Close it," Mrs. Lane said, her voice steady in that way brave voices are. "Close it now." Fletcher hesitated, and in that small space of a second something small and white slipped through the seam and fell into the grass, a folded square of paper, no bigger than a hymn slip. The preacher reached for it and stopped himself. He wrapped his handkerchief around his fingers and lifted it as if the paper might burn. The fold was neat, the crease sharp as if made moments ago. He unfolded it slowly, and inside, written in a round, patient hand, was a date, May 30th, 1880. Beneath it, a line, no name, only 2 words, "All present." The preacher looked up at the people he had promised to shepherd and knew there were only 2 choices in the world now: to open the door the rest of the way and see what waited, or to lower it gently and let the dark keep its count. The wind went very still, as if listening for which he would choose. The preacher's hand trembled around the note. He felt the soft pull of the open earth, the smell of old stone and mildew, the air that had not been touched by sun in 40 years. Behind him the men shifted their boots, waiting for instruction. They were labourers, not believers in hauntings, but no one wanted to move first. He folded the paper once, then again, and slid it into his Bible. "We close it," he said finally. "We leave it to God." Fletcher nodded, almost grateful. He and the others lowered the heavy door until it sealed with a quiet thud that sounded too much like the closing of a chest. They laid a sheet of tin across it and heaped soil on top until the ground looked level again. By the time they were done, the sun had gone high and hard. Sweat streaked the dust on their faces, and no one spoke of what they'd seen. The preacher took the handkerchief he'd used to touch the note and buried it under a fence post. Mrs. Lane led the children back to camp and forbade them to play near the north wall. That evening, the settlement felt hollowed. The air was wrong, thin, high, like a note held too long. Even the frogs along the river fell quiet. When supper came, everyone ate in small bites, listening. Just after midnight, a shout split the dark. Fletcher's wife had woken to find her husband sitting upright, eyes open but empty. He was whispering numbers, slow and careful. She shook him, called his name. He blinked once and said, very simply, "All present." Then he lay back down and slept as if nothing had happened. By dawn, 3 others reported the same dream, a room full of children counting in unison. Each swore they'd smelled wet wood and oil. The preacher called a meeting at first light. "We stop work," he said. "We pack. We go." No one argued. They took half a day to load wagons. Mrs. Lane closed her ledger and tucked it into her trunk. The children helped. Q. Wetus mice. Before leaving, Fletcher went to the filled pit and drove a single stake into the ground, 1 mark for memory. Then they left the hollow to the vines. That should have ended it. But stories travel. In 1926, a road crew widening the levee cut a shallow trench through the northern edge of the old site. A worker named Pruitt hit something solid. Boards, grey and water-swollen. When they pried one up, a rush of cold air came out, sweet and foul. They backed off quick. The foreman ordered the section filled, and the line moved east. Pruitt laughed it off that night in town. 2 days later, he didn't come to work. His bunkmate found his bed empty, boots gone, coat still hanging. The sheriff searched a week, then marked him missing, presumed drowned. His tools were found stacked neat as a schoolboy's books near the levee ditch. After that, the county rerouted the road again. The land was written off for good. By the 1940s, Cypress Hollow existed only in rumour. Hunters told tales of a bell that rang under water when the moon was high, of voices echoing through the cypress knees. One even swore he'd found a scrap of cloth hanging from a branch, white as chalk, tied in the shape of a bow. Folks laughed and told him he'd been drinking, but they didn't go to see for themselves. In 1952, a professor from the State University, Dr. Harold Wicks, came chasing folklore for a book on vanished communities of the Deep South. He followed county records, land deeds, and an aging Mrs. Lane's surviving letters, faded, careful, full of half-finished sentences. Wicks found the site after 3 days' search. The old fence posts were gone, but the soil still sank in that same rectangular pattern. He camped there one night, scribbling notes by flashlight. His journal, found later in his office, ends mid-sentence. The sound is not quite a bell. It's higher, closer to the tone a glass makes when wet. He was found dead of heart failure the next morning, sitting upright in his tent, hands folded on his knees like a man at prayer. The coroner called it natural. The locals called it the Hollow, taking back its own. Decades slipped by. Kudzu wrapped the cypress. The river shifted course, flooding and draining by whim. Only the name lingered, spoken soft, traded like gossip among people who'd never been there. Children dared each other to say it after dark. Then, in 1979, a survey plane photographing flood zones captured an image no one could explain. In the photo, taken at low water, a perfect rectangle of darker earth showed where the chapel once stood. Within it, faint as chalk lines, were smaller shapes in 4 rows of 10 and 2 at the front. When the film developed, the technician counted them twice. 42. The file went into a drawer marked Anomalies. Today, the spot lies quiet, fenced off by the state as wetland reserve. There's no road in, only a service track and the slow hush of insects. Hunters say that if you walk close enough to the fence in late May, you can still hear the soft strike of metal on metal, like a bell rung once every breath. Some nights, when the fog settles heavy, the lights from passing boats catch on the water and flash pale, as if lanterns were swinging through the cypress again, searching for someone they never found. And if you listen hard, you might hear counting, not in anger, not in sorrow, just the steady rhythm of voices too young to have learned silence. They reach 41. They never say 42. The first time I saw the field, the fence line was silvered and quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from long habit rather than threat. The sign on the post said Wetland Reserve and nothing else. No plaque, no county seal, just the flat authority of a rule meant to keep things as they are. I had driven the levee road at dusk, watching the river shoulder into its banks, brown and patient. A heron lifted and crossed in front of my headlights like a held breath. Beyond the ditch, cypress knees rose from the water in the last of the light, and a low fog unrolled itself along the ground as if it had been waiting in a folded state. I cut the engine and listened. It's hard to hear anything at first when you've come looking for something in particular. The mind edits and magnifies, so I let the place learn me instead. There was the faint slap of water on roots, a rustle where a night thing settled into its own story. Far off, a boat pushed upriver, engine grumbling like a man clearing his throat. And beneath it all, so soft it would be foolish to swear to it in front of another adult. The suggestion of a single tone, high and thin, as if a damp glass were being circled by a careful finger. I stood there a long while. The fog pulled at the fence like wool. Across the field, a rectangle of darker earth held its shape against reason. The mind says shadows come and go. The mind says your eyes are tired. The mind does not like to be reminded that it sometimes steps aside for something older than caution. Back in town, the motel room was clean in the particular way of places meant for passing through. I laid out copies of old notes and kept my hands still. The ledger page I'd been allowed to photograph months before in a county office, the one with names written in an unfamiliar hand, and the date that didn't sit right with any timeline, glowed under the lamp. I traced the air above it, not touching. The ink looked fresh even on the copy. The clerk who showed me the original had said he didn't remember it being in their holdings. "Things turn up," he'd said, and backed the folder away from his elbow like a man making room for an animal at table. I slept badly. You start to measure your choices on nights like that, the way a carpenter checks his cut against a square, even when the wood swears it's true. Sometime near dawn, I dreamed a room with benches and small backs, turned toward a window that only pretended to open. I woke to the sound of the motel ice machine knocking to itself and told my heart to loosen its fists. Over the next days, I spoke to people who had no reason to remember, and yet did. An old man who had worked a levee crew in his youth and quit after his partner failed to return from a smoke break. A woman whose aunt had been a schoolteacher in the teens and kept a habit of counting heads even when she was alone. A deputy with a face like weathered rope who said there was nothing to the tales and then gave me exact directions to the spot that no map names. Everyone's story had two parts, the thing that could be said aloud and the part that needed air around it. In the said aloud part, there was a wagon turned, a basin that drank boards, a door that refused to be named. In the other, there was the counting. It reached 41 in every version. It never reached 42. At the library, the archivist let me turn brittle county minutes until the paper sighed under my fingers. One ledger listed appropriations for a mission school and then, with no break, for a road survey. A separate volume noted land deemed unfit for development and left the Y column blank. Tucked in the back was a scrap in a different hand, the kind of thing a clerk copies when told to copy and thinks better of it midway. It recorded a request for an inquiry that was never funded. The line ended with a blot that might have been a spill, or might have been a hand lifted fast. The archivist watched me closely. "Folks come in now and then for that one," she said. "Never the same reason. Always the same look on the way out." "What look is that?" I asked. "Like they remembered a name and can't say it anymore. There are moments in any search when the shape of what you're after presses up against the thin film that keeps the world ordinary. It doesn't break through. It doesn't need to. The film is built to stretch. You take a walk to feel your feet again. You order coffee you don't want because your hands require a task. You drive back to the fence line at a slower speed. This time the river was high. The field lay in a shallow dish of light that made the darker rectangle look almost kind. Two teenagers on bikes ghosted past on the road, unspeaking, as if anything louder than tire grit might wake a sleeper. I parked a little farther on, so as not to lean my intention against the place. The sign's paint had bubbled under the weather, and a small spider had strung a perfect net between the lower nails. It had caught nothing. It didn't need to. Sometimes we make things because making is the only thing left. I walked the perimeter. The ground at one corner gave under my heel a fraction more than anywhere else, the way a floor does when it remembers a heavy piece of furniture that used to live there. I stood and counted heartbeats until my chest matched the easy rhythm around me. When it did, the faint tone rose again and hung like a thread caught on a nail. It faded as soon as I heard it. These are the rules. No one would build a system like this on purpose. But the world has been making its own systems since before we had names to file them under. The old stories said a door lay somewhere in that field, under vines that changed their minds every season. I knew it wasn't for opening. There are kinds of knowing that aren't opinions. Still, the hands betray us toward their longings. I knelt and brushed aside a layer of blown leaves. The soil showed a line, a seam no wider than the blade of a thin knife. It ran a few feet and returned to itself. If you were a surveyor, you could call it a feature. If you were a mother waiting past noon on a May Sunday in 1880, you would call it proof that time is not a clock, but a hand. I didn't touch it. I said the names I could say, the towns, the rivers, the names of saints and places people lean on when the wind rises. Then I stood up and prayed in the only way I understand, which is to say, I promised to remember. Back in the car, I wrote one sentence in my notebook. The page they tore out is still being torn out. Under it, another, all present. The weeks that followed were made of ordinary days. I returned to a desk and the kinds of questions that have answers. I taught classes about documents that can be dated and clocks that run forward only. I woke once in the small hour with a child's voice in my ear saying her letter, and then another, careful, as if she feared she might be made to start over if she rushed. I did not try to sleep again. I sat at the kitchen table until the light came in and turned the wood to a color that made it seem kind. The ledger in the county office, the one I wasn't sure had existed until I held it, went missing for a time. No one used the word missing. They said it was on loan to another department. When I asked which, they said they would have to check and then asked whether I'd like to leave my number. Weeks later, it reappeared, and the clerk who replaced it on the shelf juggled it the way you do a thing you don't want to drop or hold. The torn place yawned a little wider at the edge, as if the next line had changed its mind. I asked to see it again. Papers were signed. Lights buzzed overhead. At the table, the book lay like a sleeping animal. I turned pages slowly until the gap came. Past it, on the next sheet, a light indentation showed in the paper as if a hand had pressed hard on writing done elsewhere. I tilted it toward the light. Against the grain, a faint impression of columns appeared. Names, a date. I did not trace them with my finger. I placed a sheet of tissue between the leaves and closed the book as if I were laying a child down. Back at the fence on a different day, a survey flag had been caught by a low branch and fluttered in a way that made the air seem too busy for such a quiet place. Someone had been here with tools and the hope that a line could change a story. The flag snapped once and went still. Beyond it, the darker ground held. There was, too, an old woman sitting on a folding chair by the ditch, the sort of chair you keep in a trunk for funerals and sporting events. She wore a hat against the unsteady sun and held a paper sack in her lap. I nodded and stood a respectful distance away. After a while, she spoke without turning. "My grandmother carried a map in her head," she said. "You could point at a road that isn't there anymore, and she'd tell you where it wanted to go." I asked whether her grandmother had lived in the county. "For a time," she said. "But you know how it is. Folks move when the world tells them to. Sometimes the world speaks plain. Sometimes it just empties your cupboards and you take the hint." She opened the paper sack and removed a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. She didn't hand it to me. She set it on the grass between us, the way you set something down between two people so it will belong to both, and neither. I waited. After a minute, she nodded. Inside lay the sort of things you keep even when they have no use. A ribbon faded to the color of old teeth, a slate pencil worn down to a nub, a page torn from a devotional with a verse about the least of these, and a date written in a careful hand that did not match the printing. Underneath, folded small, a scrap with a list of first names, each trimmed short, the way a teacher speaks them when she's been given too many to hold. "Where did you—" I began. She cut me off with a small shake of her head. "I don't always remember. And when I do, it changes what it was." She put the ribbon to her nose and smiled like a person finding a drawer that still smells of soap. "You can make a life out of that, but you can also unmake one." She paused, eyes fixed on the darker rectangle. "When I was little, I thought the story was about a man," she said. "Then I got older and thought it was about a place. Now I think maybe it's about a page, and how sometimes you have to live with it missing." I asked if she wanted me to return the things to the county office. She laughed once, a dry sound. "Honey," she said, "the county office is a good place for taxes and bad for ghosts." She took the pencil nub back, then the devotional scrap, then the ribbon. She did not pick up the list. I reached for it and caught myself the way you catch yourself on a loose stair. We left it lying there between us and talked instead about the weather and the way the river changes its mind, but always says it's the same river. When she rose to go, She placed her chair neatly in the trunk of a car that had been washed recently and drove away at the speed of a person who knows there's no hurry left in certain stories. I stayed until the fog began its measured walk and the mosquitoes took stock of me and decided I would serve. Then I locked the scrap in my glove box and sat with my hands on the wheel, feeling the slight tremor of my own body settle into the pattern of the engine. When I reached town, I made a copy under hard light that flattened the paper into something the machine could understand, the list photographed in a pale way, as if embarrassed to have taken on a physical shape. I put the original in an envelope and addressed it to no one, and then I put the envelope in a drawer I don't use. Time did what time does, which is roll forward and lay a thin sheet over days until they agree to be the past. The river rose and fell. A new clerk at the county office wore shoes that clicked so precisely you could measure the building by sound. The fence took a fresh coat of paint. Near the sign a spray of wildflowers came up hard and bright, and the maintenance crew left them on purpose. Every May now, I drive the levee road once without stopping. I do not park, I do not count, I do not test the seam with my eyes. You can, if you try, become a part of a place in the way a small nail becomes part of a door. Useful, but also something that can bend and leave a better scar. I wave at nobody. The field waves back in its own way. The darker rectangle remains at the angle from which it can be denied. But sometimes I do park 2 miles upriver, where there's a public launch and the usual talk among men who back trailers into water with the concentration of surgeons. I sit on the low wall and listen for any sound that might have traveled up, changed by the miles. When a long barge pushes through, its horn lifts a note that for a second sounds almost human, almost like a call rolled into a prayer rolled into a hush. I think of the list in the drawer I don't use, and of the pencil nub and of the ribbon that still smells like a morning that refused to end. A year or 2 ago, a letter found me without return address. The paper was thick, the hand careful. It contained no greeting and no end, only a line that said, "I don't think they were taken by men," and under it, in a different, smaller hand, the words, "All present." The letters were pressed hard into the page and then softened, as if someone had touched them after and warmed them with the flat of a palm. I put that letter with the copy of the list, and one day, when weather held fair and the road was empty, I drove it down to the field and read it aloud to the fence, which is to say to the air. What does any of it prove? Nothing. What does any of it change? That depends on whether you believe that a story can unspool in both directions at once, forward into whatever this century is trying to be and backward into the room where 42 small bodies sat straight-backed and waited for what the world would decide to call them. People still go missing. That's a cold fact with numbers attached. They go missing from streets and kitchens and backyards and from their own thinking. But there are not the only coordinates. Sometimes a person goes missing into a story, and a story is a room if you let it be. In a box behind my desk, there's a bell clapper I bought at a junk store 3 counties over. The owner swore it came from a steeple that had come down before his time. He didn't know which one. When I hold it in my hand, the metal is warmer than it ought to be. If I strike it with a spoon, it answers in a tone too small to belong to a church and too steady to belong to a toy. I don't strike it often. It isn't mine. I drove the levee again tonight because the year has turned and May leans into its own shadow. The sign on the post looks newly washed. The spider has spun a different net. In the field, the rectangle darkens as the sun slips. Somewhere a boat's horn puts a shoulder to the air and pushes a sound through. I hear it. I don't write it down. Some things you don't reduce to marks. Some things you leave whole even as they refuse to be. If I were a better historian, I would end with a date and a source and an index of names. If I were a better preacher, I would end with a promise. I'm a poorer sort of both, so I end with a place. An empty field in Mississippi where the ground remembers its own weight. A ledger with a page missing that keeps teaching clerks how to file absence. A fence that paints itself back into the world every few years because somebody won't let it rot. And on some evenings, when the fog gathers like children called in from play, a note so thin you might mistake it for your own breath-catching, it hangs there a second longer than seems polite, then lets go. The river moves. The light decides. The field says nothing you can quote, and the last line never written waits, just beyond the torn edge where the counting stops and the silence, patient as ever, keeps the rest.